Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, mine website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website leongettler.com or whatever your favourite podcast platform is. This is episode number 35 in our series for 2025, and today's date is Friday, October the 10th. First, I'll be talking to Suhini Wijayasinghe, Head of HR Solutions at recruitment firm People2people, about how different generations are using AI in job applications, managing 4 different generations in today's workplace, and the importance of flexibility in the workplace. And I'll be talking to Indeed economist Callum Pickering about the latest jobs figures. They make grim reading. But first, let's talk to Suhini Wijayasinghe. Suhini, tell us about the data from the People2people's 2025 Workplace and Employment Trends Report.
Well, there's some interesting facts and figures to go through there, but I think overall we can deep dive into the stats, but it's showing that a lot of people are starting to use and incorporate AI into their lives, particularly in the professional landscape. So we've seen that Gen Z, which I don't think it comes as any surprise, are some of the highest users of AI when it comes to drafting and creating their CVs and their cover letters. Over 45% of them actually have admitted to using it and incorporating it, and sometimes exaggerating what's actually on their CV as well, comparative to their actual experience. A little bit lower when it comes to Gen X and the boomers, which I think makes sense. There's a lot more experience for them in terms of using the old school methods of the age-old brain. But overall, there's quite a large proportion of workers at the moment who are using AI.
Which creates a whole lot of issues about accuracy.
Well, that's right. And I think, what it really boils down to is how much experience have you had articulating what your experience is without AI? And I think therein lies the critical thinking piece, right? And it's not just about cover letters or CVs, although that's what we're focusing on today. But holistically, you'll find that a lot of older millennials, Gen X and baby boomers, they've gone through the process of being able to talk about what they do and the experience that they have from a very authentic perspective and with their own words. Whereas I think we're falling into the trap of not having that experience and then just using AI.
I believe hiring decisions are taking too long.
That's right. It is taking a long time to go through that hiring process. We're seeing more and more an exorbitant amount of interview processes happening for roles that don't necessarily need that. But I think that's also tying back to where we're going through this phase where people are making their CVs very robust and large scale. And on the flip side, that's also happening with advertisements and job descriptions. And so it's resulting in this overinflated process that's just being very cumbersome rather than getting to the point.
I would suggest that it might actually have something to do with the bureaucratization of businesses as well.
Absolutely. And, when you start making things very, very fluffy and there's a lack of direction, that's exactly what starts happening. And we get trapped into doing a process for the sake of doing it rather than actually critically thinking about, is this essential? Is this needed? What is the ultimate gain that we're getting from having this process? And I think we've moved into a world where, a lot of red tape is superseding what is actually beneficial.
And the job seekers are expecting to be hired in 2 weeks and employers are taking up to 6, is that right?
That sounds pretty bang on the money. We are seeing essentially that entire process from end to end of advertising to hiring and offer is stretching out and bloating sometimes to the 8-week period. We've on occasion in certain situations seeing it blow out to 12 weeks depending on the complexity of the job. Now in some cases that could possibly work depending on if they're international candidates, etc. But 9 times out of 10 it is completely unnecessary for things to be that long. And it's about being prepared, and it's about employers understanding that the employee experience starts from the recruitment phase.
And basically businesses are risking losing top talent.
That's exactly right. And this is, without digressing too much into a different topic, it's a little bit like this work from home strategy, etc. Ultimately, we are seeing new and innovative ways of working. And I think sticking your head in the sand and going, no, we're just going to do it the way that we've always done it is going to result in businesses being left behind. I mean, that is the core concept of competitive advantage. advantage. So businesses need to move away from that, or they're going to lose some great people.
So RTO mandates are damaging morale. Would that be right?
Yes, I think so, because look, whichever way you want to proceed with flexibility and returning to work and how that looks for your business, because it's going to be different for every business, we have opened Pandora's box during the COVID period. And human psyche is such that once you know what's there and once you know if something works, it's very difficult for us to go back to that. And so if you're going to harness and leverage what the current circumstances are, I think having a blanket policy of just going, we're all returning back to the office and we're not going to explore and have a conversation about what this might look like and how we can do it differently, you're just going to cause a lot of friction and resistance in your workforce.
So what's your data saying about how much negativity is that affecting?
Well, I don't have the stats and figures on me, but I know that for a fact that at the moment within Australia, there are about 40 to 50% of workforces that are actually considering, some form of a return to work, a return to the office program. That being said, we're also seeing a significant portion of large businesses who were very early to force the return to office programs actually rescinding it now because it's not working. And they're seeing that there is a significant drop in productivity comparative to when they actually had flexible offerings in the first place. And, I'm talking about big four banks and major players in big industries that are kind of going, okay, we need to rethink this. So although we saw an initial shift and a significant proportion of Australian businesses going, yep, we're going to go back to the way it was, a lot of people are putting on the brakes and going, let's take a second look at how this is going to work.
Because it's affecting workers' well-being.
That's exactly right. And I think ultimately, look, you can look at this from two ways. I personally look at it obviously from a human perspective, being an HR professional. But if I was to reach out to any employers through our conversation, if you want to look at it from a risk mitigation perspective and a cost efficiency perspective, you need to think about how are you harnessing your human talent. And part of that is human psychology. And so you can't go back to the way things were. People know that this strategy can work and people actually thrive in it. You just need to be innovative on how you manage people virtually, and it is possible. So have a think about it and just remember, one size doesn't fit all. Take it from a very individual perspective if you have to. It works.
Which means you actually need to have people on board who can actually handle that.
That's exactly right. So having a strong employee relations representative in your business, a strong HR framework in your business is essential because this is how we can pull data like we're talking about today with the use of AI and working from home and all of that to collate information that's quantifiable. It's all well and good saying, yeah, it's all, we want to do this or it's a nice to have, but we can now see that there is significant evidence to show people are far more productive from sometimes even working a 4-day week, for example, or doing different hours or different start and finish times. Flexibility does not necessarily mean it must be working from home. People have lots of different ideas about what flexibility should be for their well-being. Have the conversation, have an HR professional lead that conversation, and then quantify it back to you on what it means for the business from a financial perspective.
What your report is basically saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that flexibility is non-negotiable. And would that mean that candidates expect extra pay to return to the full time?
Okay, so two different concepts there. I think the first one is getting pretty close to becoming a non-negotiable, depending on the industry that you're in. We have to be very respectful and mindful of our frontline workers who don't have that luxury and do some core critical work that we all rely on, who aren't able to do that. And this is why I was talking about flexibility doesn't necessarily mean working from home. Work with your people to understand what that looked like for them, dependent on the industry you're in. But you're right, it is becoming very quickly a non-negotiable. It is something that's being brought up in interviews day in, day out. People are assessing whether they are basing their decision to accept an offer of employment sometimes on that flexibility piece. So yes, 100%. In terms of whether people want more salary to actually go into the office, I still think that that's a little bit of an outlier at the moment. I think that there are some people who, depending on their personal circumstances in terms of the distance, etc., might do that. But generally speaking, people are being fairly level-headed about the current situation and are more focused on the salary for the job is salary for the job, but I would like these flexible options to make my lifestyle a little bit easier.
And that would be from day one, wouldn't it?
Yes. However, I think that there are a large portion of employers that are taking a softly approach to that. And I think in those circumstances, it is wise because we do have a probation period for a reason, coupled with the fact that you should always start from a place of trust. So I think depending on the role that you're in, you need to balance those two together. Starting from a place of trust is very, very important. And I'm a firm believer that you shouldn't be managing an employee's performance based on how they utilize their benefits or how they utilize their leave or start and finish times. There's an array of other avenues you can use to manage performance. So So in some circumstances, particularly, let's say, for example, if they're a graduate, I think it's important that they are in and amongst everything to understand how it all works, etc., in those first 6 months to really see if this is what they want to do more than assessing if they're good at it. And then from that, you can talk about, what the flexible options might be as they get more comfortable. And you'll find that 9 times out of 10, even if you are waiting until end of probation, a lot of managers have the conversation much earlier anyway. You can pick it pretty quickly.
Now, one important point that you raised earlier, right from the start, was that Gen Z is using AI, but boomers and X and Y are doing it less because they're using the old-fashioned mode. That raises an interesting point. Generational differences are stark in the workplace. This is the first time we've had, 4 different generations in the workplace?
Yeah, exactly.
And what does that mean?
Well, I think, I'm going to take a step back to answer that question because, we just, as you mentioned, I just talked about how Gen Z use AI significantly. I guess the comparative that I would use for, say, my generation of millennials or Gen X is that, we had computers or calculators, for example. And so what I think is that we need to become more innovative of how we better use our time when we've got tools to shorten other areas of productivity that we used to spend a lot of time with. It's all about thinking a little bit outside the box of going, okay, well, we've got this system or this tool in place that can actually do all of the work that we were spending heaps of time on really, really quickly. What else can we do? What else is more creative and exciting? And I think if you're taking that approach rather than going, boomers don't want to use technology or, Gen Z use far too much of it, that is going to help you build the bridge between your generations much more than trying to work out where they're doing things differently for negative reasons. And ultimately, I think we get caught up a lot on, how do we manage different generations? How do we manage all of these things? But we're already good at this. And I think we get caught on this word because Australia is one of the most multicultural countries that you will find on the planet. We are already excellent at being able to navigate different viewpoints, different personalities, different cultural backgrounds, different expectations of life. We're already doing it. We're just getting caught up on a different facet that people like to popularize as something that makes it really, really hard to be managed because of the differences. But we're already managing much larger differences already. So I think it's a little bit of a bait to be like, we've got these complicated issues between age groups. No, we've been tackling that and managing that for decades since, the boom of migration in the 90s, etc. We're already across it and we need to have faith in ourselves that we've got the experience and the knowledge to manage different people rather than different generations.
Well,
Gen Z are demanding inclusivity.
So I would suspect boomers would prioritise job security, and so customisation is actually key to managing all of this.
Yes, exactly. And I think that the problem that we have, or that a lot of employers get stuck in, is that they try to put a blanket rule for everybody. And this is what I was talking about before, Leon, in terms of individualising, say, flexible working arrangements. This is a little bit of information that might be helpful to a lot of viewers, which is if you're an employer, is that these sorts of benefits, etc., particularly working from home or flexible working arrangements, they don't have to be exactly the same for 2 people that might be in the same job in a same team. I think that's a concern that people have, that it's all got to be consistent or it's not fair. But ultimately, we are all living very individual, unique life, whether that be with kids or marriages, whatever it might be. And so with that in mind, you have it not only from a well-being perspective, but also from a legal perspective, you can individualize your agreement so long as it's founded on ethical and business savvy principles. Same goes for when people are talking about what's important to me, what do I need from the business. It's never going to be the same for everybody. We already know that. Irrespective of generations, there are certain people who are driven by money and commissions and bonuses. And then there are others who just want consistency and regular, approach and contact from their managers. There is already a variety. We're already doing it. We're just getting stuck on these big key words that make us feel frightened for no reason. Have faith in the things that we're already doing well and just harness that a little better to individualize it where you can.
Well, Suhini, that is all quite fascinating, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Leon.
And now let's talk to Indeed economist Callum Pickering.
Well, Callum, the latest job figures show that jobs actually fell by 5,400 in August.
Yeah, it was a bit of a weaker result, wasn't it? Certainly the employment result surprised most economists, probably all economists. And it does continue what has been recently a pretty weak run for employment. So, as you said, down 5,400 people in the month of August. But if we look at 2025 as a whole, we can see that employment has only increased by 103,000 people. Now, to put that into some context, last year over the same period, up by 282,000 people. So employment growth has slowed considerably this year, year. And it represents a big concern because while the unemployment rate at the moment is holding pretty steady at 4.2%, if employment growth continues at the rate that we've been seeing, unemployment rate's going to spike. There's no way it's staying at 4.2% if we're getting such mediocre employment growth numbers.
So where do you see it spiking to?
Well, that's a good question. And a lot will depend on what happens with the participation rate. So one of the reasons why the unemployment rate is holding steady at 4.2% is because the participation rate has declined by 0.2 percentage points over the past couple of months. And that's absorbed the impact of those low employment figures that we're seeing. But at the moment, crunching the figures, I can see an unemployment rate of 4.5% emerging over the next 3 to 6 months, unless something fundamentally changes. We've still got very strong population growth, albeit easing population growth. That combined with low employment growth has never been a recipe for a tight labour market. So if those dynamics continue, inevitably the unemployment rate will need to increase.
As I understand it, there was a fall of 40,900 in full-time jobs, which was somewhat offset by 35,500 in part-time jobs. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. There's always a lot of volatility when we look at the full-time and part-time splits. Full-time number was pretty bad in August, but it was pretty good back in July. And so it does tend to zigzag a little bit. So it's a little bit difficult to draw some firm conclusions about that. But obviously, when you sort of take a step back and you consider both these groups together, we can see that the employment figures have been consistently weak throughout 2025.
So what's the employment to population ratio? That fell also.
That's right, yes. So all these major metrics have eased in recent months. So I touched upon the participation rate just before. The employment to population ratio is a very similar measure, and that has come down. Population growth is still growing quite strongly, up by around 2% over the past year, but employment growth has slowed. And that's pulling that ratio down, and that ratio will continue to decline unless employment growth bounces back.
What about hours worked?
That was another disappointing metric. So hours worked declined by 0.4% in the month of August. Overall, hours worked is still up around 1% over the past year. That falls short of the 1.5% increase in employment that we've had over the same period. So average hours worked has trended downwards over the past 12 months. And that's certainly something that we need to keep an eye on.
There's data from Jobs and Skills Australia that backs up the evidence of a softer labour market. It shows online job advertisements were down something like 4.2%.
Yeah, we are seeing some weakness in some of these other metrics as well. We're seeing it on the Indeed platform as well. Job postings have certainly eased recently, and Jobs and Skills Australia is consistent with that. Last week, we also had the release of the ABS job vacancy figures. They showed a 2.7% decline in job vacancies over the 3 months to August. So all of these measures are suggesting that the labour market conditions are shifting. We've obviously had a number of years of a very tight labour market, very strong labour market, and perhaps we're shifting to a different point in the economic cycle. That said, even with these measures declining, whether it be Indeed, JSA, the ABS job vacancy measure, there's still a lot of jobs being created. And perhaps the biggest concern is that so many of these jobs are not being filled because employment growth is pretty weak and there's still a lot of jobs out there waiting to be filled. There's some sort of friction going on there. There's still skill shortages. There is clearly some sort of mismatch going on between the jobs on offer versus the skills that the job seekers have. And I think that is potentially a bit of a concern as well, because if you just look at the raw number of job vacancies, it should point to much stronger employment growth than we've currently got. Now, maybe those two measures will converge over the remainder of this year. That would be great because, well, we'd see stronger employment growth. But at the moment, that's a little bit of a puzzle that we sort of need to get on top on because it's a sort of a weird dynamic.
It does help that the economy is not travelling that well.
That's certainly the case, yeah. I mean, one of the few good things about the economy over the past couple of years was that even though economic growth was weak, job market was strong. People had jobs and there was sort of no issues on that side. That's beginning to shift, obviously. And if we have a relatively weak economy, but we also have relatively weak labour market conditions, then that's going to make it much more difficult for a lot of households to sort of weather that economic storm.
I was very interested to see the speech by the Reserve Bank Chief Economist Sarah Hunter last week, where she said the central bank now sees the labour market operating at a level pretty close to full employment.
Yeah, they still think that full employment's around 4.5%. Myself and probably a number of economists think that maybe it's a little bit lower than that. Maybe it's probably around where it is at the moment. So we're certainly close at the very least. Now, that said, even if we are close to full employment, we are beginning to see a little bit more inflationary pressures come through the system. You would have seen that the monthly inflation measure has ticked up quite a bit, a little bit faster than economists had anticipated. And that's probably killed any chances of a rate cut in September and potentially even a rate cut on Melbourne Cup Day.
Oh, it's interesting because the data suggests that unless there are further interest rate cuts, the labour market will weaken from this position.
I tend to agree. Yeah. I mean, a lot of focus is being placed on this monthly inflation measure at the moment. That's sort of got a lot of economists concerned that maybe there won't be rate cuts. I tend to view things a little bit differently. I'm a little bit more focused on the job market. I'm very concerned with what we're seeing with employment growth. And like I said, I think that's going to lead to higher unemployment going forward. The Reserve Bank of Australia, in the latest statement of monetary policy back in August, said they expected the unemployment rate to be 4.2% by the end of the year. Now, if employment growth doesn't pick up considerably, that's not going to be achieved. It's going to be higher than that. And so I think there's some real downside risk to the unemployment rate at the moment. And I think that could potentially be enough for the RBA to cut rates again when they meet on Melbourne Cup Day. I tend to agree that September we're not going to see anything, but on Cup Day they're going to release the latest statement on monetary policy, which will include their latest forecasts. They often tie rate movements to the release of that publication, and I think there'll be enough in the economic data to suggest that the economy will need another rate cut.
What will be interesting will be to see the quarterly CPI figures coming out at the end of October.
That will obviously be another key, released just before the RBA's November meeting. It will obviously have a big impact upon how they're thinking about things. Now, what we have traditionally seen is that the monthly inflation report does tend to be a little bit stronger than the quarterly one. So some of these stronger figures that we have seen, particularly in August, may be revised down just a little bit when the quarterly release comes out. And if that's the case, that would certainly give the RBA plenty of reason to go forward and cut rates again, particularly given that combined with the weaker employment figures we are seeing.
Right, okay. So could see one rate cut and perhaps more in 2026, maybe?
Well, there's still a long way to go before then. Forecasting more than a couple of months in advance is always very difficult. So I think one cut is certainly probable. I'm certainly backing in a November rate cut, but I think there is potential for further rate cuts next year, particularly if the job market doesn't begin to move back to firmer ground from where it currently is.
So we can expect some more, maybe, in early 2026, depending on how the jobs market is travelling.
I think that's going to be the important part. Yeah, I think inflation will be okay. I mean, it is going to pick up a bit because of the removal of some of these government subsidies. But I think core inflation measures, underlying inflation, will be quite benign, probably in that mid 2% range, 2.5%, 2.6% maybe. I think the job market is going to be the big concern, particularly based on some of the figures that I'm seeing at the moment.
Well, Michelle Bullock has most basically said we're just looking at the data, and she kind of intimated that don't expect too many more rate cuts ahead.
Well, they're certainly being cautious. And I think that's understandable because the RBA has gotten into a lot of trouble in the past by promising certain things and then not being able to deliver. I think the RBA would probably share some of my concerns. I think they would be concerned around what's happening with employment growth and the potential impact that could have on the unemployment rate. I would be very surprised if they don't increase their unemployment rate forecast when they publish their next statement on monetary policy in November. But they're going to play their cards pretty close to their chest. They're not going to overpromise this time. And I think that's probably a good thing. I think they'd be leaning towards more rate cuts, but they're going to wait for the data to come in before making any firm decisions on that front.
Well, it's a case of lessons learned for the RBA.
Well, hopefully, because they were very harsh lessons indeed.
Well, Callum, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Leon.
So what's happening in the news? Well, lately I've noticed the impact of tariffs is starting to show up more clearly in the prices of everyday goods in the US. Things like soup cans, dresses, tools, and even car parts are all getting more expensive. While overall inflation isn't skyrocketing, there's a definite uptick in the cost of many imported items. It seems like companies that have been holding off on price increases are now passing those added costs onto consumers. A lot of this has to do with depleted inventories and the ongoing pressure from tariffs. Government data backs this up. For example, audio equipment prices rose 14% in just 6 months, and other categories, like dresses and tools, also saw noticeable hikes. Experts are saying this marks a shift. Inflation for goods had been pretty flat for a couple of years, but now it's starting to creep upward. Some businesses tried to dodge tariffs by importing early, while others, like Costco, are getting more strategic. They're cutting back on certain seasonal imports and instead stocking higher value domestically sourced items like backyard sheds. Still, more retailers are starting to be upfront about price hikes. A research group that tracks these trends found that since April, prices have gone up on a range of products from clothing and shoes to bicycles and dishwashers. Furniture giant Ashley Furniture is even planning to raise prices on most of its products, citing industry-wide cost pressures caused by tariffs. And with new tariffs being introduced, like the 25% one on upholstered furniture taking effect in mid-October, it's likely that more price increases are coming. AutoZone, for instance, hinted that they expect to raise prices further as the full weight of tariffs hits their supply chain. And the price of gold has reached record heights as the US government shutdown becomes the latest element of economic uncertainty, pushing investors to seek safety in the precious metal. At the end of last week, bullion was trading at US $3,886, that's $586 Aussie, per ounce, after a standoff over funding in the US Senate triggered a shutdown that sent gold spot prices to its record high of US $3,897 on Thursday. A range of factors has been driving the surge in the gold value, said Shane Oliver, Chief Economist and Head of Investment Strategy at AMP. One thing at play is that central banks have been increasing their gold holdings recently, fearful that if they have US dollars it could work against them, said Oliver. In particular, BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran and United Arab Emirates have reduced their reserves of US dollars. Instability in the US is also bolstering the appeal. This includes a downswing in the US dollar. Gold is priced in US dollars, so if the dollar goes down, gold goes up, Oliver said. Gold is also seen as a hedge against geopolitical tensions, particularly between the US and China, or NATO countries and Russia. Signs from the Trump administration of increasing authoritarianism are also fueling appetite for gold, Oliver said, as are lingering concerns that inflation, instead of being defeated, is lying dormant and could bounce back. He also cited comments from Trump about having greater control of the US Federal Reserve. That's a red flag. That's worrying investors as well, Oliver said. The recent US government shutdown is another layer of uncertainty. The shutdown is part of it, in that it feeds into that insecurity, Oliver said. Gold is seen as a hard currency in the short term. And the Reserve Bank of Australia's latest half-yearly financial stability review warns financial risks to the economy and business are increasing, not receding. The possibility of a material shock to the international financial system is rising, it warned. The RBA is comfortable with the health of Australia's financial system, but warns that three global vulnerabilities loom large. The first of those is the potential for disruptive major falls in global asset prices, given that share and other asset prices have kept increasing, with investors pricing in perfection and an extremely low risk of anything going wrong. While occurring after the report was finalised, the US government shutdown is seen as another manifestation of these economic and financial risks coming from offshore. So far during this latest shutdown, US share prices have generally increased as traders expect that the shutdown will slow the US economy and lead to further Fed rate cuts. Another key risk cited by the Reserve Bank is the potential for widespread cyber disruption that could spiral into a broader crisis, especially if they coincide with a period of market stress. The bank is particularly worried about the increasing reliance of large financial institutions such as banks, superannuation funds, insurers and investment funds on common tech service providers. Reliance on a concentrated network of essential service providers, often located offshore and outside the financial regulatory perimeter, increases the risk that technology outages disrupting core activities of a financial institution or third party could have system-wide effects, e.g. 2024 CrowdStrike incident, the bank warned. The third major worry for the Reserve Bank remains China's ailing property sector and its general economic weakness. Persistent weakness in the property sector amid a structural rebalancing in the Chinese economy remains a vulnerability for real estate companies, local government finances and the wider Chinese financial system, the RBA cautioned. China's property price downturn is so far worse than Japan's infamous crash of the early 1990s, which resulted in the lost decade of economic growth, or, as it turned out, a lost few decades. However, Australian exporters are far more reliant on Chinese customers than they ever were on Japan during the boom of the 1980s. And of the nearly 250,000 Australian homes that face a severe to extreme flood risk, almost 8 in 10 are not insured against floods and 7 in 10 are in places where income is below the national average. The alarming statistics revealed in the Insurance Council's annual Insurance Catastrophe Resilience Report, to be released on Tuesday, highlight the growing problem of uninsured and underinsured households. The report shows that Australia is second only to the United States for the cost of extreme weather over the past 45 years, and every decade since 1980 has been costlier than the last. This could result in more losses from more frequent natural disasters shifting onto public balance sheets. The Council has been calling for more government investment to make risky communities more resilient against climate change and to ensure insurance premiums are affordable. The cost to insurance companies over three major weather events over the first 6 months of 2025 was $2 billion, according to the report. January's North Queensland floods at $289 million, Tropical Cyclone Alfred in March at $1.43 million, and the New South Wales mid-north coast and Hunter floods in May at $248 million. Overall costs would be much higher as people who are underinsured, opting out of flood cover to make premiums more affordable, or not insured at all, are forced to cover their own rebuilding costs or lean on government grants. Insurance premiums have surged as the cost of extreme weather on insured property swelled to around $22.5 billion over the past 5 years. This is up 67% on the previous 5-year period. Australia is ranked as the second highest country for economic and insured losses for each person from extreme weather between 1980 and 2020, according to an analysis of comparable developed nations by global reinsurer Munich Re. National average home and contents insurance premiums have jumped by 14% in the past 12 months, according to CanStar last month. That comes on top of 16% jumps in 2023 and 24. In flood zones, many premiums exceed $7,000 and in some cases $30,000, the Insurance Council says. This results in many residents being underinsured or having no insurance at all. And Australian Communications Minister Anika Wells is fed up with 000 outages and the excuse that telcos are coming up with. The bosses of Australia's three biggest telco companies, Telstra, Optus and TPG Telecom, were summoned to a meeting in Canberra with Communications Minister Anika Wells this week to demand they ensure the integrity of the emergency service network during the summer disaster season. Wells says Australians have a right to feel white-hot angry with Optus about their catastrophic failure. She's putting telcos on notice. Wells has fast-tracked the legislation to set up a new 000 watchdog in a bid to prevent further outages on Optus's mobile network, like the one on September the 18th, which was linked to 3 deaths when customers were unable to call emergency services. The so-called 000 custodian will be a permanent body to oversee Australia's emergency services phone calls. Within 6 months of the laws being enacted, the custodian, via the Australian Communications and Media Authority, will issue additional performance requirements for telco groups, the government said. It is not specified what those requirements will be, but could take various forms, including benchmarks. The government would also not reveal what penalties, if any, telcos would face if they did not reach the new performance targets. This new law will empower the 000 custodian, a function conducted by a team within the Communications Department, to request information from telcos in the Australian Communications and Media Authority's infrastructure and to demand improvements to the system. The custodian's oversight role is intended to help force telecommunications companies to comply with their obligations to inform the authorities about outages to the 000 number and conduct forensic examinations to ensure the system functions better. The minister, who last week described herself as a new minister to the telecommunications industry, has been criticised by opposition politicians for failing to act faster on the legislation needed to underpin the role of the 000 watchdog. Having an independent manager of 000 was first recommended in a March 2024 review after an earlier Optus outage in November 2023. The government said this was a priority and asked the telecommunications industry ombudsman to draft a blueprint on how to do this through a steering committee that brought together government departments, industry and emergency service representatives. The Ombudsman delivered its report on the role, functions and structure of the custodian concept in November last year, but the government was unable to legislate the role before the election. And the Coalition will take spending cuts to the next election to help deliver lower taxes and smaller deficits than Labor in a high-risk strategy designed to restore a sense of economic purpose to the Liberal Party after back-to-back election defeats. In an address to the party room, Shadow Treasurer Ted O'Brien pledged to address key issues in the economy. Enough is enough, said O'Brien, of government spending, which grew at 5.5% last financial year and was the highest level of government spending as a share of the economy since 1986-87, excluding the pandemic. The Coalition will offer a different approach, hinging on 2 actions: stop the spending spree and start growing the pie, he said. It's early days, but we're already working on a plan that offers lower spending, lower taxes and lower debt than Labor, with faster growth to support higher living standards. O'Brien's plan, which he said would be led by the private sector, follows on from a keynote economic speech by opposition leader Suzanne Lee last month, in which she called for an end to growing dependency on government assistance and subsidies. She said the post-pandemic mindset was fueling intergenerational inequity by driving up debt and threatening to render the welfare system unsustainable. However, such an approach will involve means testing and paring back other forms of assistance, which is politically dangerous in an environment where pollsters say voters no longer care about debt and deficit as they once did. Also sets up a collision with the government, which has other big spending plans, such as Anthony Albanese's vision for universal childcare, a proposal he intends to take to the next election. And how things have changed. This time last year, Australian chief executives were heralding the end of flexible workplace. 82% expected white-collar workers to be back in the office 5 days a week in 3 years. But the latest KPMG Global Chief Executive Survey, released this week, shows just 22% of Australian respondents expect white-collar workers to return full-time in what represents a massive backflip on workplace flexibility. The numbers confirm what we have long suspected. A return to fully back in the office workforce in Australia is unlikely, KPMG Australia boss Andrew Yates said. According to Yates, it may reflect another year on from the pandemic, a better grasp of priorities by both sides. Employers understand that the degree of flexibility is what people expect, and I think employees, on the other hand, have also realised the benefits of coming into the office. Interestingly, almost 50% of Australian CEOs think that 3 days in the office is where this will land, and I think that's pretty consistent with my view. And Commonwealth Bank has shifted its core banking system into data centres managed by Amazon Web Services, in a move the financial services giant's technology boss says will set it up for a future where lenders are powered by artificial intelligence. The 18-month project, undertaken with little fanfare in comparison with ANZ Plus and Westpac Unite projects at rival banks, aims to make CBA's technology faster and safer and enable new products to be developed more quickly. The landmark migration of the systems that run CBA's retail, business and institutional banks into the cloud includes all the ledgers recording deposit and loan balances and the processing of all transaction, is a first for an Australian bank and one of the biggest moves